Back in 2013, I was 22 years old and decided to sell an old TV. It wasn't in the best condition but still functional, and I thought someone might find it useful. I opted to use a local online marketplace that I frequently used for such transactions. I had never encountered any problems before, so I listed the TV without hesitation. The very next day, I received a message from a buyer named Alex. He agreed to pay the listed price and asked to pick it up the following evening. He sounded polite and genuine, so I confirmed the details and prepared the TV for the exchange. Alex mentioned he would send me a text when he was on his way. The evening arrived, and I tidied up the living room, making the TV easily accessible. By 6 p.m., I hadn't received any messages from Alex, so I sent him a reminder text. 15 minutes later, still no response. I sat by the window watching the street, waiting for any sign of a car pulling up. Around 6:30 p.m., a car slowly drove down the street and stopped in front of my house. The engine idled, and no one got out. After a few minutes, the car drove away. I was puzzled but thought maybe it was a neighbor or someone lost. I sent another text to Alex but received no reply. Feeling frustrated, I decided to give up for the evening and went about my night. I had dinner, watched some TV, and went to bed early since I had an early shift at work the next day. Sometime around midnight, I was abruptly awakened by a noise. I looked at the clock. It was 12:30 a.m. I listened carefully and heard faint sounds coming from downstairs. Grabbing my phone, I quietly crept down the stairs. The noises grew louder as I approached the living room. Peeking around the corner, I saw the front door slightly ajar. I moved cautiously toward the door and heard a rustling sound from the backyard. Panic surged through me as I realized it was a man wearing a hoodie, his face partially hidden. He took a step toward the house, and I slammed the door shut, locking it. I dialed 911, my hands shaking, and explained the situation. The operator assured me that officers were on their way. Moments later, I heard footsteps running away. When the police arrived, they found no trace of the intruder. The only clue was a set of muddy footprints leading from the backyard to the street. Despite their efforts, the police couldn't identify the person or link them to any recent incidents. I was left with an unsettling feeling of vulnerability. Weeks passed without any developments, and I tried to put the incident behind me. One day, while browsing the online marketplace for a different item, I came across a listing that caught my eye. It was my old TV, described with eerie familiarity. The seller's name was Alex. He had targeted me, scoping out my home for a potential break-in. I reported the listing to the authorities, but the account disappeared before they could track it. The experience left me wary of online transactions, and I never used that marketplace again. The twist at the end haunted me. The buyer was never real, and I had unknowingly invited danger into my home. A few years ago, I moved out of my shared dorm and into my own apartment. Most of the furniture in the dorm belonged to my roommate, so I needed to furnish the new place almost from scratch. I was trying to save money and didn't want to spend a fortune on everything at once. One of the things I needed urgently was a sofa. However, after buying a new TV, I wasn't keen on dropping a lot of cash on a sofa. I browsed a few online marketplaces but ended up on Craigslist due to the variety of listings. Many of the sofas were either too expensive or looked awful. Then, I found one that seemed perfect, a simple, modern sofa for just $50. I quickly emailed the seller to see if it was still available. Within minutes, I got a reply. The seller, a woman named Nancy, said it was still available and we arranged to meet that evening. Nancy's address was about 30 minutes away in a neighborhood I hadn't explored yet. As I drove, the scenery changed from bustling city streets to quiet, suburban roads. It felt a bit eerie since it was getting dark, but I kept going. The neighborhood was surprisingly upscale, with well-kept houses and manicured lawns. I arrived at Nancy's house and saw that the porch light was on. I rang the doorbell, and a petite, middle-aged woman answered with a warm smile. She invited me in and led me to the living room where the sofa was. The house was cozy and well-decorated, which reassured me. The sofa looked even better in person, and I told Nancy I was ready to buy it. Nancy seemed delighted and offered to help me load it into my car. She suggested we have a cup of tea first since it was getting chilly outside. Not wanting to be rude, I accepted. She quickly went to the kitchen and returned with 2 steaming cups of tea. As we sipped our drinks, she started talking about her life, how she had recently lost her husband and was selling his things to downsize. Something about her story felt off. Her tone was too cheerful for someone who had just lost a spouse. I started to feel uneasy and decided to hurry things up. I thanked her for the tea and said I needed to get going. Nancy's demeanor changed instantly. She insisted I finish my tea and started asking odd questions about my life, my schedule, and whether anyone knew I was here. Feeling uncomfortable, I stood up and said I was ready to move the sofa. Nancy's smile faded, and she suddenly seemed tense. She agreed reluctantly and led me back to the living room. As we lifted the sofa, I noticed a large, old-fashioned trunk in the corner of the room that I hadn't seen before. It was slightly open, and inside, I saw what looked like men's clothing and shoes. Nancy noticed my glance and quickly shut the trunk, her face tightening with anger. She then suggested that I should come back another day with a friend to help me move the sofa. Her tone was oddly menacing. I declined, saying I'd find a way to move it myself. I managed to get the sofa out of the house and into my car with some effort, all the while feeling Nancy's eyes on me. As I drove away, I glanced back and saw her standing in the doorway, her expression cold and watchful. When I got home, I checked Craigslist, but the listing was gone. A few days later, I saw a news report about a man who had gone missing in that same neighborhood. The picture showed the trunk from Nancy's living room being carried out by police. The missing man had been Nancy's previous buyer, and the police suspected foul play. I realized how close I had come to becoming another one of her victims. "3 years ago, I was a 29-year-old living far from home. I had to relocate temporarily to support a sick relative. Finding a place to stay for just a few months proved challenging, as most landlords required a minimum lease of 6 months or more. After days of searching, I turned to Craigslist, desperate for a short-term rental. I found a quaint, secluded cottage. It was advertised as a cozy retreat and had a flexible lease, which seemed perfect. The owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Larkin, was kind enough to agree to a 3-month lease and instructed me to pick up the key from a nearby cafe. Upon my arrival, the cottage was charming but remote, nestled in a dense forest. Mrs. Larkin had left a note with instructions and a key on the kitchen counter. The house was rustic and slightly musty but otherwise livable. After unpacking, I settled in and watched TV. Around 8 p.m., there was a knock at the door. I was puzzled, as Mrs. Larkin had mentioned no scheduled visits. I peered through the peephole and saw a man standing on the porch. He was dressed in work overalls and had a serious expression. I opened the door, greeting him cautiously. He introduced himself as Jake, a maintenance worker sent by Mrs. Larkin to check the heating system. The cottage did have an old heater, but I wasn't aware of any maintenance being scheduled.
"It's quite late for a maintenance visit,"
I commented. Jake shrugged, explaining that his schedule had shifted and he was just finishing up a series of appointments. I asked him to wait while I checked with Mrs. Larkin. I called her number, but it went straight to voicemail. I wasn't sure whether to let him in, but Jake's claim about the heating system made me hesitant to refuse. I reluctantly allowed him inside and showed him to the heater. As he worked, he kept glancing around the small cottage, which made me increasingly uncomfortable. Suddenly, he asked if I had a spare tool for adjusting the system. I went to fetch it from the kitchen, and when I returned, Jake was standing near the door, acting strangely. He insisted he needed to inspect the basement for a complete checkup, which I found odd since I hadn't mentioned any issues there. I hesitated but decided to comply, walking with him down to the basement. As we descended the stairs, I noticed how dark and cold it was, and Jake's demeanor grew more unsettling. The basement was cluttered with old furniture and boxes. Without warning, Jake lunged toward me, but I dodged and sprinted back up the stairs. I locked myself in the living room and dialed 911. Meanwhile, Jake tried to force open the basement door. The police arrived quickly, but Jake had vanished. They searched the area and found his abandoned van parked far from the cottage. It was clear that he had not been authorized to perform any maintenance. In the end, the twist revealed itself. Mrs. Larkin was a fictitious persona created by Jake to lure unsuspecting renters. He had used the ruse to scout out potential victims, hoping to break in under the guise of repair work. His plan had almost succeeded, but I managed to escape before things could escalate further. The cottage was secure after the incident, and the authorities were able to prevent any future encounters with Jake. I learned a valuable lesson about the dangers of trust and the importance of verifying all details when dealing with strangers.